Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conti. The science of genealogy transcends all historic eras. And on tonight's show, we are going to feature the Victorian era. And joining me tonight, I am very honored to have as my guest a very bright young man. His name is Brian Schnell. Brian is currently the Assistant Director of the Jefferson Township Historical Society in Jefferson, New Jersey. He is also the recipient of an award from the National Honor Society because of his work in history. And he just loves the Victorian era. And on tonight's show, Brian is going to teach us about the various sources that are available in order for us to find our Victorian roots. And now let's welcome our Victorian historian, Brian Schnell. Brian, welcome to my show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. You know, I think you were born too late, Brian, because you love the Victorian era, and I see that you are attired in a very elegant garb that was very popular in that time. Can you explain to our viewers what you are wearing?
Yeah, certainly I can. So on top I have a frock coat. Now this would be typically worn toward fall and winter periods, but you could also see it during the summer months depending on the formality of the event or if the person really wanted to dress up. This comes from the medieval and Renaissance periods where they would wear knee or calf length frock dresses or gowns with woolen stockings underneath.
So this was for both male and, the word frock is for both male and female.
Yes, at the original time during the period it was for men and women both.
Right.
But over time the fashion did evolve into separate fashions.
Right, and you did mention about the number of buttons that would typify something. Can you tell our viewers that?
Yes, actually. The more buttons that a person would have on their frock typically referred to their social status. So a more wealthy aristocrat would have far more buttons than a standard working class person.
Right.
And that refers directly back to military uniforms of the time.
Okay, and you have a very colorful vest. Can you just open your coat there and
Yes,
show us your very elegant vest there? Was this very popular in that time as well?
Yes, vests were extremely popular at the time. It was a matter of how you would present yourself, so you always wanted to look your best.
Right, right. And it was an era of more decorum.
Yes, it was an era of much more decorum. Your morals were much higher than they would be today. People always saw themselves as, I have to be the very best that I can be. I have to be the best for my family.
Right.
I have to look my absolute top-notch best in society.
And you look your best right now.
Thank you, Stephen.
Okay. Now, give us the span of years that designate the Victorian era. What years are we talking about here?
We're talking specifically about between 1837 and 1901, which was the reign of Queen Victoria.
Right, and hence Victorian.
Yes.
And we just lost Queen Victoria's great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, a direct descendant of Queen Victoria.
Correct.
Right. And it was also the era of Prince Albert.
Yes.
Who was the husband
He was the husband, but they were also first cousins.
Yes, yes, I read that somewhere. Yes. And in that family, I guess because of that cousin relationship, there was a lot of hemophilia.
There was.
She had 9 children.
She did, yes.
Right, right.
And as a result of that, because of that, a lot of the aristocratic families of Europe are all distantly related.
Yes, well, they call Queen Victoria the mother of Europe.
Yes.
Of the crowned heads of Europe. Yes, okay. Now, of course, we're talking about England, but the Victorian era spilled over into our country as well.
Yes, it did. A little bit later than it did in England.
Around what year would you say?
I would put that probably about 10 years or so after it really spilled out in England, so around the 1840s, 1850s.
Right, that would be the like mid-Victorian. Okay.
The middle of the period.
Now, we spoke about the impact of the Victorian era, and you mentioned morals, of course.
Yes.
People are very Victorian in those days, okay? And some people are like that today as well. The fashion, which you are exemplifying right now, and we do have some photographs of both men and women in Victorian fashion. And I know we spoke about the gentlemen, but the women wore a lot of layers of clothing in those days. Can you explain that?
Yes, they would typically wear anywhere from 3 to sometimes over 15 layers of dress and petticoat, depending on when in the period it was, what the event was, or even how they felt like dressing.
Right. And what is a bustle?
The bustle would be the part on the back that would make their rear end look much bigger.
Oh, my word.
Because at the time, that was seen as something that was desirable.
Right. And of course, you all know about Victorian homes, and we have a lot of them right here in New Jersey. Victorian architecture. You can
Yes.
always tell Victorian architecture. And on the set, right next to Brian, is a Victorian home. And in the town of Newton, New Jersey, it is a big, beautiful yellow Victorian home.
Yes, I don't remember specifically what the family name is.
Merriam.
Yes, the Merriam.
Right.
Yes.
I think he was a shoe manufacturer, and we do have a photo of it. It was
Yes.
a beautiful home.
It is.
And we're going to show you a series of these Victorian homes right here in New Jersey. Now, there are 2 towns here in New Jersey that vie for the most Victorian concentration of homes. Can you tell us what those towns are?
Of course, they are both Ocean Grove and Cape May, New Jersey.
Right. And they say when you own a Victorian home, you have to have a tool shed with a lot of tools and paint because, you know, there's so much to fix in the Victorian
Yep.
home, especially that gingerbread.
Yes, that is very difficult to fix sometimes.
Right. And they're also called painted ladies. Have you heard that?
I have briefly.
Right. Painted. Because I lived in a Victorian home as a boy, and it was very beautiful and very elegant. They always had that big front porch, and I guess it would be the cupola on the very top of the house, or the owl's nest, we used to call it. Right, right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about the sources, the genealogical sources that one can use from the Victorian era. And of course, we have to mention the census records.
Of course.
Okay? And of course, 1850 is smack in the middle of the Victorian era. And tell us about the 1850 census, which is a very important one, and tell us why.
The 1850 census is very important, primarily for within the museum where I work, because it's one of our first records of the family that lived in the house. It lists the members of the household. However, it does not show their relationships.
Right. So you get the head of the household, and then everybody in that household.
Yes.
And you can usually figure it out, like a son, daughter,
Yes.
brother, sister. Yes.
Because it also lists the members of the household's ages.
Right.
So that does make it a little bit easier.
Right. But as we go more into the future, Brian, the records get nosier.
Yes, they do.
Can you tell us how that happens in the 1880, which is still the Victorian period?
It is. In the 1880 census, the records do become more nosier. It lists the relationships to the head of the household.
So that's a gold mine for the genealogist.
It really is, yes.
Right. And then the next one we would have would be 1900.
Yes.
And that does that differ in any way from the 1880, or do you get even more information?
You get significantly more information. You can sometimes see occupations, parents' names, parents' ages, reverends, who married, who...
Right.
It just depends on which section of the census.
Right. So the 1850, and I'm sure the 1860 would help you, and the 1870 is very good for African Americans.
Yes.
Because it's after...
It is after they were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's right, and that's a very helpful census for the researcher.
It is.
Now, there are some typical Victorian sources that we're going to talk about. Every era has a typical thing, okay? And during the Victorian times, there were many, I call it ephemera, many sources that one could use. And Brian is going to share that with us, and we're going to show you examples of these. And the first one I have is a calling card. First of all, what is the definition of a calling card? We don't have those anymore.
No, we do not, Stephen. The calling card would be a card with your name, sometimes a photograph of yourself, if you were wealthy enough to be able to afford that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it would list your occupation, and it would sometimes as well list the relationship you have with the person that you're bringing the calling card to.
Now, when you say calling, that means you're visiting someone.
Yes, you would go up to their home, knock on the door, and their housekeeper or another family member would greet you, take your calling card up to the head of the household if they were home, where the head of the household would decide if they wanted to see you or not.
And will some of these have a photograph?
Yes, some of them will.
Right. So I guess it depends on the wealth of the person to have these calling cards.
That is correct. You could get them as somebody who had lower wealth, but they would not be as extensive or elaborate as some of the more wealthier ones.
Right. Now let's look at some of these calling cards right now. And the ones that you showed me were very flowery. These belong to the women.
Yes.
And there was something else about these calling cards.
Yes. Interestingly, some of the calling cards for women, now, while they were not as common, some of them were actually perfumed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that would be to remind the head of the household, oh, I know exactly who this is based on the smell.
They could recognize
Yes.
the scent of that woman.
Yes.
Isn't that something? Yeah. And how would the men would not put their cologne on
No,
theirs?
no,
Yeah.
certainly not.
And what would the men's calling card look like?
The men's calling card would look like what I had previously mentioned, the standard calling card. Sometimes a photograph, their name, occupation, their relationship to the head of the household. You would sometimes even go so far as to see, records of visits on
Right.
there.
Really? So now, where can one find these? Do you have any of these calling cards in your museum?
We do have a couple on display right now. They are for our current exhibit, which is of men in mourning,
Right.
Victorian funeral traditions.
Right. Now, these would be a home source. People might even have these up in the
Yes.
attic or in a shoebox somewhere, not even
It's
know
very,
it.
very possible if you have an old enough family.
Really? Really? Okay. Now, I know the Victorians, they had a kind of morbid interest in death. Can you explain this to us?
I sure can. Now, I can't fully explain why, but it really reflects back from Queen Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
When Prince Albert died in 1861, she was very, very distraught, and for the next 40 years of her life, she was in perpetual mourning.
Yes.
And
yes.
because of that, that filtered down into mainstream society.
Mm-hmm.
And you would see things like funeral announcements, like what we have, like what I have right here.
Yes, a funeral
Yes.
announcement. And what can you read what would be on there? That is a very good genealogy source.
So this one that I have in my hand is actually it's a reproduction of one that we have on display at the museum.
Yeah, yeah. And
Inside, it would show almost an epitaph, a poem on one side,
yeah.
and then it would give information on the decedent, their services, and anything else the family saw relevant.
Can you read that one for us?
I sure can. Would you like me to read the epitaph
Sure.
or the information?
People
or
collect
both?
epitaphs. The
Sure.
whole thing I want you to
Oh,
read.
of course, Stephen.
Yes, yes.
So the epitaph reads, sleep on, beloved, sleep and take thy rest. Lay down thy head upon thy Saviour's breast. We love thee much, but Jesus loves thee best. Good night. Until we meet again before his throne, clothed in the spotless robe he gives his own. Until we know him even as we are known, good night. With the family's grateful thanks for much valued sympathy.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side, it says, in affectionate remembrance of Carolyn M., beloved wife of Joseph S. Fisher. entered into rest after a long affliction, which means she was ill for a very long time.
Yeah.
June 7th, 1887.
All right.
And it also shows her interment, where it is, and when it was.
Very good. Very good. So would you sometimes get a photograph of the person who has passed away on these cards? I've seen them on memorial cards or obituary cards.
It was very, very uncommon to have it printed on there, but sometimes there could be a photo included.
Right. And you showed me something, and I think we have it here, a post-mortem photograph. Can you tell us about that, how that was done? Very morbid, but people did that.
It is a very, very weird thing to do, and we really don't do that anymore. I've heard people complain that we don't do it anymore.
Yeah.
But how it would work is they would take the decedent and either prop them in a chair or put them in the coffin, and they'd have the family surrounding them. Or they'd have them posed in some almost family portrait.
Right.
And that was because a lot of the times that was the only photograph of the person that would ever exist.
Isn't that and they would do that with children?
Yes, they would. Children, pets, basically anyone that would die.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned Queen Victoria, who loved her husband, Prince Albert, very much. And she was in mourning for the rest of her life over him. We had the same thing here with Mary Todd Lincoln.
Yes, we did.
And I think Mary Todd Lincoln took it one step further. She would she would consult mediums, and she would go to seances.
She would host them in the White House as well.
Yes, and this was also very popular.
It was.
During the Victorian era. I mean...
It was very popular in the Victorian era, but mostly after the Civil War period of 1861 to 1865.
Right.
Because it was, at the time, the most bloody war, and still the most bloody war America has ever fought. And that was due to the fact that so many lives were lost. People never got the opportunity to really say goodbye to their loved ones.
Right.
So it was almost a form of closure.
Right. Now, again, with these funeral announcements, where can these be found? In your own home, if your family went way back, or where would you find these?
You could find them in your own home if your family does go way back. Some museums do have a collection of them. Because they are printed on thicker but less durable paper, they typically will not bring them out of storage just because of the fragility.
Right.
You could also find them, sometimes some libraries will actually have records of them.
Isn't that
either
something?
on microfilm or actual physical copies.
Yeah, because they are a genealogical source.
Yes.
I mean, you have the name here and you have the date. Now, the epitaph, would that be transferred onto the tombstone?
Sometimes it would be, and sometimes it would not be. It really depended on the family's wishes and the decedent's wishes.
Right, very good. Yeah. Now, let's get to the Jefferson Township Historical Society, where my fine young guest, Brian Schnell, is the assistant director. But before he became the assistant director, you had another title, and what was that title?
I was their research assistant.
All right, and what did that entail? Tell our viewers what you had to do in that job.
That entailed finding information on whatever exhibit we were doing. Typically, we stay within the Victorian period.
Right.
We have strayed outside a little bit. I would have to help them find information on how burials were conducted for the current exhibit, for example.
Right.
How burials were conducted, different types of caskets, notable burials, generally anything obscure that they wouldn't already have.
And you have done some genealogical research
I
also.
have.
And I know you call yourself a historian, but you're becoming a genealogist without even knowing it.
I am, Stephen.
Because I know you just had a recent find. The Jefferson Township Historical Society in the village of Milton, in the town of Jefferson, and the county of Morris,
Yes.
in the state of New Jersey, is a must-see. It's a lovely Victorian cottage built in what year?
It was built in 1874 for George Chamberlain and his wife Ruth Elizabeth Speaker Chamberlain.
And they were a very popular family in that
They were one of the
area.
founding families of the town.
Of Jefferson.
Yes, they
Right.
have been in the country since the 1690s, and in Jefferson easily since pre-revolutionary times.
And this cottage was built. Tell us why this cottage was
This
built.
was built by George Chamberlain's father, Amos Chamberlain, as a wedding gift, and it's directly off of what used to be one of the Chamberlain properties within town.
Right. It's a very beautiful place. I went there on a tour a few weeks ago, and Brian was my tour guide along with other members of the society in Victorian attire. So, and how often do you have those tours there?
We are open the first Sunday of the month from 1 to 4 p.m. unless there is a holiday that falls that weekend, in which case it's the following weekend.
Right, right.
However, we will be closing our season for the winter after our December 3rd and 4th participation in Christmas in the Village.
Isn't that wonderful? Yes.
it is.
Very, and you've been with the society for how long now?
About a year and a half now.
A year and a half. So you are a Victorian historian.
Yes.
Okay. But you know other areas.
I
other
do.
eras.
I am familiar with a lot of other areas. I typically also work with military records because a lot of the Chamberlain family did have
Yes.
contributions to the numerous wars that were fought.
Right. And they were a premier Victorian family.
They were. They were.
And we do have a photograph at the beginning of our show. That was the George Chamberlain family.
Yes, that was George Chamberlain, his wife, and two of his three sons, Raymond and Archie.
And they were raised in that.
They were until the family became too large to fit within the home, and they moved a little further down that one road that the museum's on.
Right. So this is where the society is and where the museum is.
Yes.
And there's a wonderful gift shop in the museum. So please go there and tell us one more time when you have it's the first weekend of every month or something like
Yes,
that?
the first Sunday of the month, unless there is a holiday that falls that weekend.
Right, right.
Yes.
And you know descendants of the Chamberlain
I do,
family.
actually. We still have two living within the town.
Right.
Nancy and her brother, Horace Chamberlain.
Who are not direct to...
They are not directly descended from George Chamberlain, but through his brother, Wesley Chamberlain.
Right, right. And you just found a document.
I did. It is the marriage register from the state archives for George Chamberlain and Ruth Elizabeth Speaker.
And your society was looking for that for a long time.
We've been looking for that forever, for longer than I've been there. They at one point did have a copy, but it has since vanished.
Right. And at your society, what do you have there now? You said you had a display there right now of something.
Yes, our current exhibit, which will be closing after our next open house on November 6th, is of Men and Mourning, which is a display of Victorian funeral traditions,
I see.
featuring works by the Bronte sisters, Poe, and Robert Louis Stevenson.
These Victorians had a fascination for the afterlife or
They
something.
really did. They really did.
Isn't that... I guess the life expectancy wasn't as long as it is
It was
now.
not. It was not. When Queen Victoria passed, she was considered extremely old for the time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, yes. So in review, we have the census records,
Yes.
1850, where you just get... Tell us once more the information you get on there.
The information that you would get on the 1850 census would just list the members of the household, and if you're lucky, their ages.
Right, and you can usually figure it out.
Based on that, yes.
But then the ensuing census
the ensuing
records...
census got more and more nosy
Right.
about occupations and ages in relationships to the head of household.
So you see the whole profile of the Victorian family.
You do.
Okay. And also the calling cards.
Yes.
These are the meat and potatoes of doing that research.
Yes, they are.
And the funeral announcements, which are very important.
Yes, they are quite important because sometimes they will list, like I read, from an affliction. It will give you an insight as to what they passed from.
Right, right.
Currently, we are still searching for the funeral announcement or anything relating to do with the death of one of George's sons, Clarence.
Yes, he was a
Yes.
young boy, I believe.
Before the age of 3.
Yeah. I guess there were a lot of epidemics in those days.
There were. We aren't 100% sure of what he passed from, but we believe it could have either been a sickness or from drowning in the pond that used to be back behind the museum.
I know things like diphtheria,
Yes.
pneumonia, things of that nature plagued our Victorian ancestors. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a wonderful interview with my fine young guest, Brian Schnell, who is the Assistant Director of the Jefferson Township Historical Society right here in Jefferson, Morris County. Am I
Yes.
right on that? New Jersey. Thank you so much.
Oh,
and
of
as I
course.
said, I think you were born too late, but I'm glad we have you here now. And thank you very
Of
much for
course.
coming on my show. And on that note, as I've been saying for many, many years, remember, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conti wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.